That's awesome. I'm excited. All right. Good morning and welcome back. Hope you've had a good weekend. We're getting really close to the end of the quarter. We just have 3 full weeks left in the term. So we will be spending some time this week basically talking about 3 final types of interviews. And these are 3 of the 4 options that you can choose from and utilize for your final interview presentation in the class. And then we'll use the end of the term to just do those final interviews. So I look forward to those. Again, rather than say that you have to do a specific type of interview, I'm asking you to indicate a preference. And then of those options, you and your partner will both be assigned a type of interview. So we get to see these last styles of interviews in action. I encourage you to think about a type of interview that's especially interesting to you or maybe especially relevant to you. And I'll take some time to talk a little bit more about those. Also, I am still working through the grades on your employment interviews. Should have those in by the end of the day today, but I do want to take some time to offer some general feedback, things that I noticed, things that went well, and things to continue to work on as you gear up for the next interviews in the class. So as we're getting started, we wrapped up the employment interviews last class, saw our last set, so thank you for doing that. I really enjoyed getting to see those. Today, I want to debrief and provide some general feedback about the employment interviews that can both be useful as you gear up for your final interview in the class, and also useful as you think about how you can get out and do these types of interviews in the world. We'll be talking more about the final assignment expectations and what the remainder of the class schedule is going to look like, so you know what to expect in the weeks ahead. And then the style of interview we'll be talking about today is the persuasive interview. So we'll be getting into some examples and explanation of what that type of interview looks like and how that kind of interview can be effective. So let me go ahead and start by talking a little bit about the employment interviews. I think this was a really great and useful opportunity to see people do these interviews. I really enjoyed the range of things that people were interested in applying for. I felt like we were able to learn a lot more about each other and what we were interested in. And I really liked getting to see you all do that. I really liked how you all had specific jobs or positions you were interested in applying for, things that you kind of knew the details of pretty well. And I also really appreciated how, in general, partnerships did a really great job of saying, okay, so you're interested in this job. Here are questions and research that I can develop in order to engage with this type of interview effectively. So I really enjoyed not only that interviewees thought of questions that they could answer in regards to a job, but that both parties really showed good research. I also thought in general, right, folks did a really good job of avoiding interview questions that were too generic, right, and too like boilerplate, why do you want this job? I thought people did a good job having questions that were specific and adapted to the details of the jobs that they were applying for. So I really liked that, you were able to utilize that and develop questions that made sense for the kind of job that you were participating in. And I also liked, again, this is across the board, something that you should always do whenever you are applying for a job is coming in with questions that you as an interviewee want to ask the interviewer at the end, right? At the absolute worst, you have a set of questions that you're not going to be able to get to. It's always a good idea to come in with more questions for the interviewer at the end of a job interview than you might have time for, because maybe you have a ton of time, you've got a lot of questions you can ask, or maybe you pick the most important ones. One thing you can do that's a really useful interview prep strategy is maybe develop like a set of 5 to 7 possible questions that you have listed in order of importance. So based on the time that you have in the interview, right, you can think about which questions make sense to ask. You can cut out questions that have already been answered in the interview itself, and so on. So I thought people did a good job of posing interviews. This is a great way to show interest. It can be a tiebreaker, right? When people are deciding who to hire, if somebody comes in with questions and interests that show that they care about the position, well, that's really impressive. So one thing that I would encourage, right, is, again, a common style of question, and one that we saw in this round of interview, is a question that identifies a possible weakness or thing that the interviewee can work on, right? And so While there was some good engagement here, I thought that there were a number of responses to that question that could be improved and developed as a part of the interview, right? If somebody is asking you, what is a weakness that you feel like you have as a candidate? I think there's a strategic way that you can respond to that question and maybe expand on what we did in class a little bit, right? So couple things to think about here on a weakness question. First of all, right, weakness question should not be something that is central or crucial to the position, right? So if you say, I'm not very good at communication, I'm not very good at working in groups, that could be a huge red flag, right? So being careful about a type of weakness that is not going to be a deal breaker is important. And also, I think one element that was missing from some of the interview responses was to say, I have this weakness or I have this problem, and I am taking XYZ steps to address it, right? So you might say, I have trouble working in groups, I'm a lot more of a solo-oriented person. However, I've started to take on more partner and group work in my classes, and I've started to understand how I can do that effectively with clear communication, right? So don't frame a weakness as just the thing that's true about you. Frame it as a thing that you are working on and trying to address. One other thing, and again, I know that maybe as a student, you're not necessarily coming in with as much direct experience for the position you're applying for, although you might, is just to try to use rich examples from your own life. Think about the stories and examples that really resonate with you, right? Using the problem, action, response method, or stating the problem, offering the action and solution and resolution through the STAR method. Really walk us through the use of stories, the use of examples. Maybe you tell us about a time where you were in an internship and you dealt with this problem effectively, right? If I'm deciding between two candidates, the candidate who gives me an example of how they show honesty is going to be a lot more persuasive than the candidate that says, oh, I'm really honest, right? So avoid too much saying about your qualifications and focus a bit more on showing the interviewer some of those. And then the last thing to think about here is just that some of the opening and closing of the interviews from the part of the interviewer were a little bit sudden or jarring. I thought people did a good job of having some openings that explain the position and the details of that position. But in particular, some of the closings, okay, those are my questions, or all right, done, right? Oftentimes you want to close an interview out by really thanking the person for the time to interview, discussing the next steps, really trying to wrap up and make a good impression, right? Because again, an interview is a two-way street. The interviewer wants the interviewee who is applying for the job to feel like they would want to work there and have a good impression. So closing out an interview effectively, restating main points, providing a direction of where to go next is something to continue to work on too. So a couple of the closings were a little bit jarring. All that to say, though, I thought people did a really solid job on these. Their timing and pacing was generally really good, and I appreciated the quality of questions. So thank you for that, and all things to think about as we move ahead into our final interviews in the class. So on our yesterday, I went ahead and I put together a Google form and circulated that to you that indicates your preference for final interviews. So this Google form basically is giving you the chance to pick between the 4 types of interviews that you can choose from for this final one. I just want to do a quick blurb about these so that you know what to expect. And then if you do have access to a device, such as phone or laptop, I'll give you a few minutes to do this if you haven't done so already. So basically, there are 4 options that you can rank in order of preference from your top choice to your bottom choice. I'll do my best to respect them and also to put you in partnerships with people who have similar interests, although I can't guarantee that you'll get your number 1. So these options, first of all, is a performance interview, right? So we talked about that shortly before the employment interviews. A performance interview is when you are evaluating somebody's performance in a job from the perspective of the supervisor or perhaps coworker, right? So somebody comes in for their annual review in a position, you talk about what went well, and you develop some coaching about how to move ahead. So one way you can do this is to either use a real or fictional position that one person is in and use the chance to review and talk about their performance in that position, right? So both the interviewer and interviewee be in the partnership and then you switch. You could be reviewing for different types of jobs, right? But the idea here is that one person has a position where they're evaluating and discussing and coaching the next steps of the other person. The second option here that we'll be talking about today is a persuasive interview, right? So the goal of a persuasive interview is if you are the interviewer, you are trying to persuade the interviewee to do something. One example you might think about is a door-to-door salesperson, right? Somebody who's trying to sell you something. They might ask you questions, right? Or if you're like me and you get a ton of like spam emails and calls from Spectrum Internet trying to get me to get on their plan, right? Like oftentimes they're going to ask questions. What internet provider do you use? How much do you pay for that provider, right? But that can also be a persuasive interview where you are asking a student about a college or perhaps about grad school, joining a team or club, right? Your goal as an interviewer is to convince the interviewee to do something and address any sort of concerns or issues that that person might have with doing that. So you can collectively decide, on each end, what type of thing the interviewer is trying to convince the interviewee to do. Again, these can be two different types of things within that partnership, in the same way that you and your partner might have been applying for very different jobs. Third of all is a counseling interview, right? So this is coping with a major problem. This does not mean necessarily that you are coming in as like a mental health professional, like I'm dealing with depression, here's what I need, right? Think about counseling more broadly as there's an issue that the interviewee is encountering, and the role of the interviewer is to help that person work through that issue. So one example of this might be in terms of career counseling or career coaching, right? Talking about what that person wants to do or where they want to go next, right? So I want to make sure to respect your boundaries on this and not say, oh, you need to talk about personal, serious mental health and related issues. If there are things you're comfortable sharing or disclosing in the class, you're welcome to do so, but it's designed to have the interviewee be supported by the interviewer in whatever it is that they're focusing on. It can also be the use of a fictional example too. Like I'm trying to decide between going to grad school or, pursuing this job. So there's some options here in what it is that you're choosing to counsel about. And then healthcare interviews, right? So generally speaking, this involves the interviewer who's seeking out information, trying to gain insight on the issues that the interviewee is having. So, trying to check up on, understand. This could be in the context of physical health, mental, social, and again, the level of disclosure you're comfortable with is good. Sometimes I've had people, for instance, who are in health and human performance. Maybe they are walking through the process of somebody who has a broken arm or somebody who has issues with a particular medication and walking through the process of helping somebody to navigate those types of issues. So you can develop an example, whether real or fictional, of a particular topic or concern that that person is working through, and as an interviewer, guide the steps and try to address that. So hopefully this is useful as you're thinking about these options. I'll give you a little bit of time to continue to think about these, and then we'll come back together to talk about this a little bit more at about 10:15 to 16. Anybody who is working through this form and needs some more time? And if you don't have a device with you, if you're still on the fence, I just encourage you to get that to me by the end of the day on Wednesday. And I'll also, again, continue to respect the form that you filled out at the beginning of the term with your schedule and availability. If you do know that there is a change in your availability and days that you can and can't attend, please let me know by the end of the day on Wednesday so that I can make sure that I'm representing that in scheduling your partnerships for the final interview. And again, I'll shuffle the partnerships and times to account for, if you presented earlier, you get to present later and vice versa. For this final interview, right, you are going to be working in a new partnership with an interview date that's set during the final weeks of the term. I will get that out to you on Wednesday once I've collected all the material about preferences for these types of interviews. Your partnerships, again, are going to be determined by interview preference. So I'm going to put people in interview types that both people were interested in. You and your partner will have the same type of interview, but you can focus on different things. Again, just like applying for different jobs, you and your partner could focus on different types of performance interviews, right? So for example, maybe both you and your partner are doing persuasive interviews, but A is persuading B to join a club, and B is persuading A to go to law school. So with that being said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the schedule, address a question that I have for you all that you can think about here as you gear up for that too. And just point to a couple other things to know as we get to the end of the term, right? So this week, again, as mentioned, we're going through these types of interviews. We've got a quiz due on Sunday. Next week, hooray, long weekend. We don't meet because of Memorial Day. I also want to let you know there's an extra credit opportunity that you'll be turning in on June 15th for credit if you would like to. It's optional. And there is a final reflection paper that you will need to turn in on the 15th too. The final reflection paper is just a 4-page essay that is discussing the concepts that you've learned from the course, including some skills in applying and developing different interview styles and the ways that you are using those skills to prepare for goals in the future. So just know that that is sort of like your final, right? It's a chance for you to reflect on the process of interviewing that you've done in this class. And then the extra credit opportunity that's also due on the 15th is an opportunity for you to participate in an interview outside of the class. For example, a mock interview, EOU Career Services, or actually an interview that you're applying for some type of position, or an interview that you do in more informal context with somebody that you know, and then to reflect on and describe the process of doing that outside interview. So just note that's coming up. So the thing that I wanted to check in about, and I don't need an answer today, I think we will lock this in on Wednesday, is that I want to offer a little bit of flexibility in the options for you. So one option is to stick to the schedule as we have it here, where we would be doing the interviews Wednesday, Friday, Monday, and Wednesday, and then that Friday, you would not be required to meet. We would get done a little bit early because we would be wrapped up on that. We might have a job candidate who will visit too on that last day, depending upon how that schedule plays out. The other option is that we would bump everything down a day. So Wednesday could just be an attendance optional workshop day for you to prepare for the final interview. And then the final interviews would be scheduled for Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So the options would be either that we stick to this schedule and this Friday is an optional day, or we bump everything down to give you extra time to work on preparing, working with your partner for the interview, and then the interviews would be happening later. So I'm not going to ask you to respond right now, but I do want you to think about of those two, which you would prefer. Would you like to get out a little bit sooner, or would you like more time in order to prepare for that interview? And we will come to a full decision on Wednesday. And also make sure, again, that your schedule is being respected in the days that you are scheduled to get that interview. Okay, any questions before we get into some of the nitty-gritty of persuasive interviews? Yeah.
Do you know when we're going to get our partnerships?
So I will have that to you by Wednesday. Once I get the preferences and information about the types of interviews people want to do, then I can get those things locked in. Awesome. So let me know at any point if you've got any other questions. But let's go ahead and dive into the persuasive interview. So as I mentioned and previewed a little bit, the goal of a persuasive interview is for you as an interviewer to persuade the interviewee to do something, to believe something, to adopt something, and so on. We hear this in a lot of more maybe negative ways. Somebody's trying to sell you something. You're asking questions about, your cell phone provider. Maybe you're walking down the street. They're like, what provider do you use? How much do you pay? Right? But other times it's designed if somebody is recruiting you for a club, for an activity, they're asking questions about your future plans. So there are some things that the survey interview is kind of setting up, has helped you to set up for, to think about for this style of interview, right? Another concern here in developing a persuasive interview is to think about ethics, right? As an interviewer, you are trying to ask questions and persuade and get somebody to do or to believe something. You want to make sure to do so in a way that's honest, that is reflective and considerate of the other person. It's not misrepresenting things, right? And saying, oh, if you come here to EOU, the quad is always packed, right? So that's not necessarily true. So making sure that you're being clear with that person and honest in the arguments you make is important. And being honest, fair, direct, and deliberating over the issues is important too. One thing that can happen in the persuasive interview process is that the thing that you're trying to convince somebody to do or believe might not end up being a fit for them. And creating the space to acknowledge that is important, right? So maybe somebody is being convinced to adopt a dog, and over the course of the interview, they realize, well, the person doesn't really have the resources to take care of a dog. Right. So sometimes deliberating and discussing the issue in an honest way leads to a conclusion that is not aligned with the interviewer's goals. So one thing that I think is useful as we're talking about persuasive interviews is to think about persuasion more broadly, right? Thinking about rhetoric, tools of rhetoric and persuasion, and how we can use those effectively to engage in the interview process. One way of thinking about this is to think about the sort of differences between beliefs, attitudes, and values, right? So at the core here, we have a value, which is the set of things that people consider to be important. For example, we're looking at spiritual views. You might value particular things such as honesty, directness, politeness, right? What are the things that you see as important and really crucial to you? You also have this broader circle of beliefs. What do you believe to be true about the world? Again, for instance, everything happens for a reason is a belief that you might have about the world. And then an attitude, right, describes a more general feeling that you might have about a topic. For example, I really like cats. That would be an example of having an attitude that might be informed by your beliefs and values, right? And I mentioned this for a few reasons. When you're doing an interview, it is nearly impossible to change somebody's values, right? Somebody's set of long-standing beliefs that they've developed through their culture, through their experience, through their interactions, are probably not going to change over the course of a 10-minute interview. So oftentimes, especially if we have political and cultural debates and discussions, values are difficult to convince people to feel differently about. A belief, right, that's also pretty challenging, right? Because how somebody believes or feels about a topic could be altered if they are gaining more information. They think that adopting a dog just can't work for them, but then they come to understand that there are ways that they can do so effectively. And then an attitude, right? How somebody thinks or feels about something, that's generally the most malleable of the three. Somebody's attitude towards something could be changed. For example, maybe somebody has a very negative attitude toward grad school. They think, oh, I'm not going to do it. It's not really for me. But they're recruited over a course of an interview and learn a lot about grad school and about the process and come to feel much more positively about it. So an attitude can be changed a lot more easily. So focusing on attitudes over the course of an interview, understanding somebody's attitudes and the way of changing those attitudes can be really useful, especially if the attitude somebody has is not necessarily coming from the most informed perspective, and they're learning something that they didn't know before from the interview. So when you conduct an interview, right, one of the first steps here is prospecting or finding potential leads, right? I always think of Glenn Ross, the film that has this like very over the top character by Alec Baldwin talking about the importance of like finding good leads and trying to get people to adopt or change the values. Think about this in like other contexts, things such as real estate, advertising, marketing, right? Generally speaking, the goal is to find people who are potentially persuaded or influenced, like you are, a recruiter who is visiting various high schools to potentially recruit athletes to come to EOU. So finding people that are relevant who might have attitudes that could be changed. The target audience is a really important goal. Generally speaking, you should avoid cold calls. In other words, when you have selected people that you're interested in, generally speaking, it's a good idea for a persuasive interview to plan a time to talk about something, right? If you are a high school student and suddenly somebody comes up to you and you're like, hey, have you thought about coming to EOU, right? Maybe they're taken aback and a little bit anxious. But if you say, I'm interested in talking with you about your college plans and seeing if EOU might be a fit, when can we chat? Setting that up makes somebody feel a lot more comfortable going in, right? When people are taken aback, when they're surprised and shocked, they're less likely to change their beliefs, right? They clam up versus the opportunity to really open up a discussion to the style thing. Also, right, as mentioned, considering people's values and beliefs, desire for survival and basic well-being, desire for success, doing well, some of their social needs as well. Is this a location where I can get my social needs met? Is this a position or opportunity that allows me to be independent? And is this something that will support my progress and work toward my broader goals? So sometimes a way of effectively framing a persuasive interview is for the interviewer to understand the interviewee's perspectives and say, look, I think something like coming to EOU is a really good fit for what you're interested in and want to explore. So as mentioned, right, we've got beliefs that are coming from these core values and attitudes that involve a combination of beliefs that are arranged in some way, and again, might be more likely to be changed over the course of the interview. So again, if we think about the idea of doing a persuasive interview, it's useful for us to think about elements of rhetoric and persuasion that we know work and can be useful as a means of making this interview achieve its goals, right? Because at the end of the day, maybe you're being evaluated in your job on the basis of effectively convincing people or, getting the change that you want over the course of an interview. So, right, rhetoric refers to the available means of persuasion. It's how people are using arguments and structure to convince people to adopt different values and beliefs. Again, we go back to the Greeks. Aristotle was concerned about rhetoric making the weaker argument the stronger and about how people might use rhetoric in a way that's dishonest. Somebody's trying to sell you a car, right, and they leave out details. They ask you the kind of car you're interested in. Maybe they're selling you a lemon that breaks down within a few miles. So it's important to engage with honesty while you're trying to convince somebody, because it can be easy to embellish or be dishonest in the process of trying to get somebody to do or believe something. Picture two on the right is Kenneth Burke, who is a scholar who developed a very complex understanding of rhetoric and how it works. Burke was very well known for rhetoric of motives and of the idea of identification, right? So identification deals with the idea that we are more likely to be persuaded by something if there are commonalities between us and the person that's trying to persuade us. And when we find things in common and when we see ourselves in the person we're engaging with, we're more likely to be convinced. Think about it this way, right? If you had like a motivational speaker or somebody on campus, right, who was talking about like addiction, talking about drugs and alcohol, maybe somebody involved with there, right? Generally speaking, that was a person who had some personal involvement or story about being involved with that themselves, who was able to relate to the students through that. Or, right, you are recruiting, you have somebody who's recruiting or interviewing you to be like an EOU student athlete. And what do? Well, you typically will have somebody interview who is themselves an athlete at EOU, who's more available to answer questions, to describe the experience of what it's like to be an athlete. A coach can do that. A coach can do the interview, right? But they don't necessarily, relate to the experiences of being a student the way that a current athlete on the team might. It's more persuasive to have somebody more similar to you who's interviewing you, who can better speak to your own experiences. So finding things in common with the person interviewing you that's helping you to answer questions and show that you understand them is a really useful strategy. A few years ago, I was getting a car, and the person selling me the car was like, "Oh yeah, my wife has this car and she loves it. She's had a really good experience driving this car." And that was, part of the argument was, well, I'm using this car, so you can trust that it's a good one for you too. Inoculation, right? So one step that's important here is in the interview process, thinking about potential issues, challenges, or pitfalls that could come up between you and the interviewee. For instance, somebody is being persuaded to adopt a pet, but they live in a space that doesn't allow pets. So maybe you talk about how you can issue an exemption or how you can work with, landlord about allowing pets in certain situations. So thinking ahead about possible thorny things that could come up for the interviewee is important, right? Or somebody's trying to convince you to donate to, nonprofit, and they're worried, well, I'm in debt, I can't really do that or make the commitment, and offering a sort of smaller financial contribution. Induced compliance, right? This is a problem because we don't want somebody to be voluntold to do something. Somebody should be acting in their own free will if they're adopting a change in what they're doing, at least they have. So we do want to indicate that somebody is free and able. One way of doing this is actually to play devil's advocate, right? To say, there are some problems with grad school. There are some things that, you might not enjoy. There are some things about being an athlete at UU that might not work for you. How do you feel about these issues? Generally speaking, people are more likely to be persuaded if you're presenting the full picture, right? You're identifying some of the possible problems or issues. You're really trying to see if somebody's the right fit for something. Because if somebody's interested and then they're told some of the downsides, then they're trying to think about and weigh that option, and they show, you're showing them that you understand they're weighing those downsides with them too. You're not only showing them the good things. So there's what's known as psychological reticence theory. The best way to think about this is that a lot of times people don't like being told what to do. People like feeling like the decisions that they make are theirs to make and that they have independence, autonomy, and power in how they're making their decisions. So this theory is important in something like a persuasive interview because while you're ultimately helping to persuade and convince somebody, they're making their own choice at the end, right? They're deciding where to go to school. They're deciding, whether or not to go to school. They're deciding, what they want to do. You're providing them resources, support. You're providing a case, but ultimately it's their decision about how they want to move forward. So when you are restricting their ability to make a decision, then that can be a big downside that makes the persuasive component of the interview backfire. When it comes to developing some strategies of conducting these types of interviews, one way to do this, of course, is to gather information, right? Again, we've used a lot of opening strategies, gather demographic information and other data about the interviewee that will help us. Similarly, you can do this here. Learning a little bit about somebody and their plans can help you to develop specific questions and ideas that will connect, right? This can also be useful before the interview even starts to learn about the person and their background. Verification questions can also be useful. Sometimes you're screening and you're saying, okay, well, are you still interested in this? One time I was being asked to participate in a survey, and so a verification question was being used that was like, do you still make $40,000 a year? And at the time, I was a broke grad student, had never made $40,000 a year. So I was like, no. So that verification basically restricted me from the persuasive interview. They were trying to get me to get a timeshare. There was no way I was going to do that, especially with the amount of money I made. Attention and interest questions, right? So attention is getting somebody's attention by spotlighting or highlighting something really specific. We offer some of the least expensive 4-year tuition in the state. We have these great opportunities and pathways, right? Making this interesting, but also presenting questions. Say, have you thought about graduate school, right? Building rapport with agreement questions. So oftentimes it's more persuasive to start with questions and topics that both parties will for sure agree with so that you have momentum as you're getting into more difficult issues. It seems like you're really enjoying playing football. What are some of the things that you enjoy about that? And then you're starting to use that to discuss how they might take that interest into joining a college team. And raising an objection question. You might say, there is this problem, there is this issue, does this still work for you, right? So again, playing devil's advocate, raising possible concerns, makes the interviewee need to explain how they can work around those things and be a fit for somebody. When you're being interviewed, there's a variety of different ways that you can choose to respond to questions and to think about some strategies here. One of them is what the yes, but. Yes, I am interested in doing football in college, but I'm worried about, paying for tuition and using that to indicate some of the challenges or barriers that impact somebody. Yes can also be used to indicate somebody's support for multiple things. Yes, I want to do this, and yes, I'm concerned about this aspect. And then implicative, right? Implicating or suggesting something. So, I am worried about budget. I am worried about getting student debt, implying and suggesting a possible concern that the interviewer can choose to address, right? There's also what's known as a shock absorber phrase, where if somebody is dealing with a question or issue that's putting them on the spot, they're essentially insulating that, right? They're saying, for instance, well, I'll have to think more about that, or I'm not sure how I feel about that, right? Like as a way of mitigating a potentially potential interview question that could put somebody on the spot. And then when it comes to closing a persuasive interview, right? One idea here is the idea of a trial closing of explaining that, well, I appreciate, you talking about and walking through this and kind of wrapping up the interview in that way. A contract or agreement, right? Maybe at the end of the interview, you've got a contract for something, right? You are trying to convince them to sign on and join a team, and you actually have the paperwork for them to do that. Based on your responses, it seems like you're a really good fit. Here you go. That's not always the case. Sometimes you're at an earlier stage. Sometimes that can be the ultimate result of this type of interview, is that you are looking for a commitment from that person to do something. And then leave taking, like before, somebody is explaining sort of the next steps, they're wrapping up. They're explaining how and in what context that information is being used. Perhaps it's providing people with resources and saying, well, I know that you're not going to necessarily apply for graduate school, but I do want to leave you with this packet that contains more information. And I also want to give you my card and contact information if you've got more questions for me. Generally speaking, at the end of a persuasive interview that has some degree of success, right, there's something that the interviewee should have, should do, should be able to accomplish that you've gained from that process, right? Rather than wanting somebody out who's trying to get you to sign something. And sometimes that means waiting, saying that you need more time, or you're willing to make a commitment. You as an interviewer, taking the time to give somebody what they need to prepare for that final stage. When you're being interviewed, right, in a persuasive interview, it's good to think about the imagery that's happening, right? So how is this issue or topic being portrayed? How are you being represented? How is the other interviewer conveying and expressing their views? Is this something that I see as good? Or, am I being interviewed for joining a team, and the person who's trying to recruit me seems exhausted and uninterested, right? So the perception is important. Sometimes it's good to be strategically ambiguous. If you're not ready to commit, you say, I'm thinking about options for colleges. I don't want to fully commit yet. Jargon, right? Sometimes people get wrapped up into phrasing, jargon, and abbreviations that the interviewee might not know, and asking about and clarifying jargon is useful. Again, euphemisms, using phrases that really mean something else. Sometimes it's important to bridge those gaps, especially in regards to culture, if you're not understanding what the interviewer is saying. Differentiation, right? Figuring out what might be different between what the interviewer says about you and what you really want. You might say, no, I'm happy sticking to my own plan right now, and I don't really see a change as being a good idea. And also consider logical fallacies, right? So sometimes we know that an interviewer is not going to be totally honest or upfront about what they have to tell you. So it's a good idea to think critically about what you're hearing. One example here is a slippery slope. Slippery slope fallacy is, if you do or don't do this thing, then this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, like going down a slippery slope, right? If you don't get this insurance, then your flight's going to be canceled. You're going to be stranded in the middle of nowhere. You're going to have nowhere to go. You're not going to be able to pay for it. You're going to have to like go use a payphone, get some cash, and then you're going to have a friend drive half across the country in order to be able to get you home. Don't you want to get insurance, right? So be careful about how people are using logical fallacies and poorly structured arguments on the part of an interviewer that you're picking up on and pushing back against. Right? There should be a good argument or good reason for you to do something that's coming about through the interview process. So there's a few different types of arguments, right? Narrative arguments is telling a story. You know, maybe you are an athlete and you're talking about your own experience as an athlete and the process that you went through that brought you to EOU. That can be really compelling. Somebody using their story and experience to humanize themselves and present that argument. An argument from sign is saying X is a sign of Y. So when there's smoke, there's fire. When you seem like you're graduating, you've got a good path ahead, graduate school is a good option. Argument from cause, X is helping to achieve Y, or X caused Y to happen, right? So, you know, I was unsure of what to do, but by joining EOU's soccer team, I was able to really balance both my success in academics with extracurriculars. Appeals to popularity and credibility. You hear this all the time in advertising. We're the #1 internet provider. We're the most affordable, network in the state, blah, blah, blah. And then contextual reasoning, right? Using your understanding of the interviewee, their concerns and anxieties. You seem a little bit hesitant about LeGrand. Let me tell you a little bit about what it's like to live in LeGrand, right? So using and picking up on cues from the interviewee, checking in, maybe asking questions of the interviewee can be a useful strategy to make sure that you're connecting with them effectively in your use of arguments. So for your attendance today, what I'm going to ask you to do, and you can do this either on your own, or you can do this with up to 2 other people and work on a single document or paper together. Assume that you're conducting a persuasive interview to convince somebody, a high school student, to join EOU. What are the kinds of questions that you could ask under this persuasive format? What are the types of arguments that you could use to convince the student? And if you were in the shoes of the student, what would be some concerns that you would have about this interview? And how might you, as an interviewer, go about addressing them? So feel free to work on your own or find somebody else or 2 that you would like to work with on this attendance activity, and think about how these elements of persuasive interviews could connect to conducting that interview as well.
Yeah.
Take about 2 more minutes to continue your discussion and work here. And this doesn't need to be exhaustive, just a starting point for how you might do this kind of interview. Take that remaining minute to wrap up your thoughts and ideas here. So as you're wrapping up your work here, this is useful in thinking about persuasive interviews. This is an example of the kind of scenario that you can do this type of interview. Talk about how you'll have the option, again, by class Wednesday. Make sure you fill out the form if you haven't done so already. Talk about persuasive interviews is one of those options you could choose from, and how we're adopting a change through the use of structured argument. On Wednesday, we'll be looking at counseling interviews, getting into the nitty-gritty of those. So please pass forward or email the work that you put together today if you haven't done so already. Have a great rest of your morning and see you again on Wednesday.